Well, thank you very much, Mara, and it's great to see so many of you here today. Can you all hear me even at the back? Okay, good, so I won't use a mic in that case. And the fact that you're here already makes you, by definition, very curious, right? Because we're here to talk about learnability or curiosity, and my idea is to give you an overview of the science and the psychology that underlies this project that we embarked only about maybe 5 or 6 months ago, so we've made a lot of progress in this short time. And as you heard, for those of you who seen the video that we did maybe in November, that has gotten a lot of traction, at least you can see today, I'm not an actor that was brought in here but actually this is my work and my main job. So my specialty and our specialty at Hogan is in assessing people to predict relevant work or career-related outcomes. And independently of Mara and Jonas, whom we had this discussion with in maybe May last year about what we thought were some of the most important or critical work-related competencies in the present and the near future, and coming from very different perspectives, we both arrived at the same conclusion that curiosity, the desire and willingness and the ability to learn new skills and keep on developing and lifelong learning, if you like, is going to be very, very important. And I think it's Mara who coined the term learnability, which is a great, great concept. So I'm going to refer to the concept as learnability at times as curiosity, at times as the hungry mind. It's all interchangeable in one way or another. And my idea is to provide kind of some overview of the science and why learnability is important in the world of careers and work. Okay? And as you heard, there's a kind of direct connection with some of the work that we've been doing recently. I hope, how many of you have taken the LQ assessment? Okay, very good. And I hope you were happy or satisfied with the feedback and your scores? Yes, so? Okay, more or less? Gentlemen there, not so much? Okay. So, as of today, I think over 20,000 people have completed the assessment, which is amazing, given that it hasn't been rolled out that long ago. And we think there's going to be many, many more thousands who complete it. And I think we think of this not just as an important kind of marketing tool that can raise attention or direct people's attention to our thought leadership campaign here, but also give people self-awareness and help them understand, what their general level of curiosity is, what they're curious about, or in what ways or areas they can best deploy their learning potential. Okay, so this is just to refer to you to the LQ, but it's great that so many of you have taken it. So what do we really mean by learnability? And actually, before this word was coined and really invented very recently, I think it's important to understand that there's a very well-established science, mostly within psychology, decoding individual differences in learning potential and learning motivation. Okay, and really broadly, you can think of learnability as somebody's willingness to learn or love for learning, not just learning in the traditional sense of reading a lot of books or reading, books about philosophy, history, or science, but also learning skills, learning practical, hands-on skills or aptitudes, and of course, learning things that are relevant, such as interacting with technology or picking up kind of skills related to the digital age. Okay, so it can be manifested in various domains, in various fields. There's a very influential psychological theory to explain how learnability or the hungry mind really works as an instinct, as a basic instinct. A guy called Berlin in the 60s came up with a concept of epistemic curiosity. And he said what's interesting about this fundamental instinct that to some degree all humans and all species show is that unlike other instincts, the more you satisfy it, the more dissatisfied you feel. Okay, so the way it works, basically, you can think of it as the way learnability works from a motivational standpoint, is that you have a desire to know, and then when you start learning or studying something, you realize that there's a lot more you should learn or you need to learn, and that creates an even higher willingness to learn. So most of you will, or all of you will have experienced this at some point in some domain, right? If you're interested about something and you're curious, you decide to learn a little bit or study a little bit, and then you freak out because you realize, wow, I'm actually very ignorant, and there's all this stuff, and then you keep going, and if you keep, and so it's a self-perpetuating or snowballing effect that means that the more you learn, the more you want to learn. And conversely, the less you learn or the less curious you are, the less you learn and the less curious you become. So that's quite interesting. And what we know from a psychological assessment or profiling standpoint is that there are certain personality characteristics that are associated with higher learnability and with lower learnability. You don't have to think of learnability or curiosity as just a personality trait. It's clearly a set of behaviors and a motivational trait or attribute. It can be influenced by environmental and contextual factors, but above all, we know a lot about the personality or dispositions that basically create very, very noticeable individual differences in learnability. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this now and give you, instead of showing you tables and charts and statistics, just some pictures. You can almost look at these pictures, and the more pictures apply to you, the higher your learnability probably is. What you will see is that this is a very heterogeneous concept. When you talk about IQ or extroversion or anxiety, it's very specific. This is a big, big kind of syndrome that has as its main features or facets a lot of diverse things that normally don't go together. Okay, so the curious people here would like this because it's quite complex and ambivalent or ambiguous to some degree. So what are these main characteristics? Okay, and we start with kind of the obvious one. I mean, high or strong intellectual and aesthetic preferences, okay? And I won't go over all of these, but what I want to show just with one slide is that we don't just mean books or music or cinema or art, modern art. It can be furniture, design. I mean, anything that is maybe that can be considered as kind of snobby aesthetic preferences, okay? Which is the opposite of kind of mainstream or popular. There's a wonderful, Oscar Wilde was probably the emblematic figure of the aesthetic movement in the 19th century. He has a great quote to sum this up. He said, everything popular is wrong. Okay, so you can think of taste in any domain as normally distributed, and if you're at the high extreme, and you're part of the 5-10%, it means you have a very cultivated, sophisticated taste. And that's why you can go to the Tate Modern and see Tracy Emin's Undone Bed and think, wow, this is a masterpiece. Yeah. Whereas if you're very low in learnability, you say, this is disgusting. How can this person call herself an artist? Wasting our time. I mean, she can't get a proper job and so forth. If you watch documentaries or Ingmar Bergman movies, as well, and you really enjoy it, I mean, it has to do with a very high need for cognition, and you gravitate towards complexity. But above all, there's an attitudinal element here, motivation, that you want to you have a desire for higher aesthetic status, and you want to set yourself apart from the mainstream and the norm and be kind of sophisticated. Okay, so and not all of them would apply to most people here, but I'm sure that if you are high on learnability, there will be a few. It can be manifested, in your musical taste. So it's more likely that you like Stravinsky than, let's say, Justin Bieber or Miley Cyrus, and so forth. Secondly, it's also manifested in political ideology, attitudes, attitudes towards the environment, religion, philosophy, healthy, lifestyles in general. So the higher your learnability score, the more likely it is that you're a Democrat, the more likely it is that you sympathize or that you have time for kind of anarchic political ideas, the more likely it is that you're agnostic or an atheist, the more likely it is that if you have a religion, that the religion is Buddhism, the more likely it is that you tolerate or support a kind of different rights, whether it's gay rights, gender rights, women's rights, and so forth, the more likely it is that you don't eat meat and that you're a vegetarian or a vegan, okay? Can you see how there is a lot of different things here? I'm not making this up. There's tons of studies showing this pattern of correlations that distinguishes between people who are higher and lower in openness to experience, curiosity, or learnability. And you can actually look at maps, for example, even in the same country. If you look at the electoral map of the US, for example, you will see that there's a very strong correlation between how people vote and all of these behaviors, which doesn't surprise any political analyst. But what's surprising from a scientific point of view is how strong these correlations are. Okay, so I could ask you whether you're a vegetarian, whether you believe in God, what do you think of these kind of minorities, what your religion is, and then I don't need to ask you, for example, if you're a Republican or a Democrat, or how you voted, or who you voted for. Okay, and this works also in other countries, and you can do it at a global level. So we've seen snobby aesthetic preferences and an appetite for high culture, political ideology, and other attitudes. The one that stands out, or is kind of, you can say, is even more unusual, but also covarious, is thrill-seeking, yeah? Which in the LQ assessment we called adventurous, so whether you're an adventurous person or not. So I mean, thrill-seeking is the sensation-seeking component of curiosity. And people who are very curious or high on learnability are also more likely to have an appetite for these adrenalizing activities, okay? So if you like speed diving or tsunami surfing. Any tsunami surfers in the room here? It's an actual activity. Yeah. We don't know how many people survived here, but there's people who are not just content with surfing, but they wait for a tsunami to happen, and if they know in advance, they travel to the place and they take their boards and talk about sensation seeking, or walking between buildings, diving with sharks, or just roller coaster riding. That is also indicative of having a hungry mind or having higher levels of curiosity. And then as well, higher levels of creativity, imagination, and mind wandering. It's interesting, there is now all this kind of euphoria, crazy euphoria for mindfulness, as if we all have to engage in mindfulness or meditate and all our problems will be solved, and we all should. And actually, depending on where you are on the learnability quotient, you will be able to do that or not. If you're very high and you have a very hungry mind, you're very creative, and you suffer from something that psychologists have labeled low latent inhibition. You're unable to inhibit or exclude irrelevant thoughts from your mind, okay? So if there's very creative people in the room now, you're suffering from this probably right now, and even though I'm talking and you're looking at me, you probably have really irrelevant thoughts and you can't control them. If you can, that's the source of creativity, because you have unusual or unconventional ideas. You see things that other people don't, and if you can get your act together, then you can create something new or novel, okay? So it's like the inability to filter irrelevant thoughts can contribute to high levels of creativity. So you can see it in people who have, there's a lot of tests, for example, for divergent thinking, where you ask people, tell me all the things that you can do with a chair. You have 2 minutes, and you have to generate as many responses as possible. And if you're very low on creativity and learnability, you might say to sit, and nothing else comes out, And if you're very high, you'll come up with really, really weird things that are almost inappropriate and antisocial. But as we know, there's a very thin line between creativity and psychological disorders and mental illness. That's the reason for it. It's a well-known fact. It can be manifested, of course, in entrepreneurial intentions or entrepreneurial accomplishments. Steve Jobs is obviously a very good example of this. He would go on vision quests and pop pills as well, and walk around campus, forgetting to dress. And he had, you can see in his, is a very good case study for this, because you can see the antisocial, narcissistic, and kind of unpleasant, obnoxious side of his character, but also this incredible ability not just to generate ideas, but recognize and appreciate ideas in others. Okay, and this takes me to a kind of final slide on the personality characteristics of higher and lower learnability people, which is the dark side or the downside of curiosity. Of course, we know curiosity killed the cat. There is an element of truth or kind of logic in that statement. We know that there's a thin line between being kind of nonconformist, rebellious, but also really enjoying breaking rules and breaking the law and having problems with authority, right? This is clear if you look at the biography of any self-made billionaire, entrepreneur. You don't have to, read too many pages to find that actually they had almost like a criminal mindset in a way and managed to create something legit and not get arrested. And I'm not just talking about people, modern entrepreneurs. If you look at the biography of Walt Disney or Henry Ford or the Carnegies or the Rockefellers, all the same, okay? But a lot of people can't kind of control or find a legit output for these tendencies, so they just end up, misbehaving or putting their own or other lives at risk or in danger. And it's very interesting because, we live in the Western world. We kind of glorify disruptive people and being rebellious and being nonconformists, but any society needs a big majority of people to be conformists and to follow the rules and to actually be boring and obey. So there's only, I come from Argentina where everybody is like this and the country doesn't function very well, compared to, let's say, Singapore or Sweden. So a mix or a balance is probably the best case scenario. So high learnability also means a much higher proclivity to binge drink or be an alcoholic, smoke, take drugs, and also, other risky activities like, for example, having multiple partners, casual partners, unprotected sex. As I was looking for the image for unprotected sex, it's a lot easier. It's a lot easier to Google image drugs, and this comes out, or smoking, drinking. When you put unprotected sex on Google, lots of unpleasant diseases, come out. Or Charlie Sheen. Charlie Sheen comes out, which is amazing. So then I started to mind wander, and I said, what's Charlie Sheen doing these days? He's still alive, and he's actually a really good example of high learnability. He's incredibly intellectual. If you read his tweets, you almost need a PhD in metaphysics to understand what the hell he's trying to say. The use of words, the content, and the style of his writing. And then I kept on looking, and he's also running for president in 2020. I don't know if this is a joke or not, but he is, so maybe there's something to consider there. Hashtag Sheen Cruise 2020. But I think you get the gist, right? So it's a whole syndrome of related but not coherently similar dispositions that co-vary. Okay, so which also means that two people can have the same high, medium, or low learnability score, but be very different in their profile. For some, it will be eating exotic foods, liking spicy foods. For others, it will be diving or swimming with sharks, and for others, it will be going to the opera. And so we try to account for some of this variability in our LQ assessment because we look at the social side of learnability, the kind of ideas or cultural side of learnability, but also the adventurous side of the trait. So what causes these differences? Why are some people higher than others, whether it's regardless of the specific areas? Why are there these individual differences in learnability? And first of all, we know a lot from behavior genetic studies that compare identical and non-identical twins to what degree differences in openness to experience, which is the term that psychologists have used mostly to refer to learnability, are a function of environmental forces or genetic forces. And for most psychological traits, it's around 50-50, okay? Which doesn't mean that we're sitting on the fence, but actually that there are some genuine biological factors that cause early dispositions and some environmental forces that are at play as well. What's interesting is that for openness, it's a little bit, the genetic influences are a little bit higher than for other personality traits. And the main reason for this is that openness is linked to a neurotransmitter called dopamine, which actually drives exploration. If you're high on openness, again, high on learnability, it means you get bored very quickly. And to address this kind of boredom and this kind of basically rapid propensity towards boredom, you need to explore the world and counterbalance that and do things, right? So all the activities and the pictures that I showed in my previous slide have in common that they arouse the mind. You know, they're feeding your hungry mind. So if you're very low on openness, you have no desire or no need to do that because you're already quite stimulated, okay? So because of this, we know that there are national and geographical differences in openness or curiosity. You can see here the United States is a little bit higher than average. What's perhaps more interesting is the kind of not genetic, but epidemiological analysis that people have done of these differences. It's a great paper published a few years ago that found that basically there's a correlation between how curious people are and how cold the region is. The colder the region, on average, the more curious people are. And there's an evolutionary explanation for this, which is that in cold regions, the risk of parasitic infection is lower. Okay, so you can go out and explore sexually and socially and relate to people who are different from you, and there's less of a risk of getting infected and getting a disease. Okay, this of course snowballs because as places become more open-minded people move to those places, not just because the coffee is better and they can go to a vegan sandwich place, but also because people are more alike, you know, from a kind of intellectual perspective. So this is very, very interesting and explains why, I mean, you can look at this geographically within the same country and different, of course there's going to be exceptions, but there is a strong effect here relating to these differences. Some of you will be familiar with the work of Hofstede, the guy who was at IBM and profiled the different kind of values of cultures, and he kind of did a profile of national values, and here's his taxonomy, which is very famous. There's one scale in the Hofstede model, uncertainty avoidance, that is strongly related to learnability. Some cultures, and you can think of cultures at the level of countries, organizations, maybe teams, and maybe ethnicity, nationality, whatever you want, but certainly there's always differences in how cultures tolerate ambiguity or ambivalence, okay? Think of people as well. Certain people, you know, they have a very high need for closure. Everything has to be black and white. They are afraid of the gray zone, and they have a very, very strong propensity to or high need for closure, which means that they push things either, you know, it's love or hate, nothing in between, okay? That's the opposite of a high learnability profile, which is being so comfortable with ambiguity and complexity that almost anything goes, you know, anything goes. I mean, it's quite counterproductive in some ways, because you get excited about everything, you see the potential everywhere, etc., and you know, maybe you become a nihilist or a kind of postmodern philosopher, right? If that is it. It's a lot clearer, certainly, if you're looking at leaders or people in authority position or power. It's much more inspiring for people to have somebody who seems to know exactly what's right, what's wrong, because most people don't. Okay, so that's interesting because you can compare, again, I use Argentina and Singapore as the opposite example. You can think even within Europe, compare Northern Europe, Mediterranean countries. You can compare different areas in the US. You can compare different continents, and you'll find these differences. And what do we know about the career-related consequences or importance of learnability? This is, of course, very important to all of us. What I said so far is maybe interesting, but a number of factors that say more about the human species in general. We want to know how that affects people and their work. And a few years ago, we did a very, very big meta-analysis of the predictors of academic performance. Okay, so in school, primary school, high school, university, postgraduate, and what you find is, of course, that IQ is a predictive variable. You also find that motivational levels, so whether it's conscientiousness or ambition, also contributes to higher academic performance. But there was a third pillar that hadn't been considered by people before, which is curiosity. People who are more open, more inquisitive, end up doing better. Even though most of the formal educational system everywhere is almost designed to destroy curiosity, because you're supposed to kind of vomit back in an exam what the teacher or the professor said during the, and it's very kind of convergent in its teaching, and it's still based on a very, very old, archaic model of knowledge reproduction. And even so, people who are more curious with higher learnability, who actually, it's a much less economic approach to studying because you get carried away and start reading about lots of things that are not relevant to the exam paper or to the assessment, they still ended up doing better, even when we statistically control for the level of IQ, for their previous academic performance, and for how conscientious they are. Why is that important? Because, of course, how you do in your studies influences how well you do later on. Not necessarily because of what you learn, but because in your CV, in your resume, it will be an important filter. Yeah? In most places, you can't get good jobs unless you have certain academic qualifications. We also know that learnability is a major driver of employability. Okay? So if you think of employability as the ability to gain and maintain a desired job, there's huge differences between people, even if they are in the same country or city and from the same social class, or even factoring out all these extrinsic variables, there's huge differences in how employable people are. Okay? And why is there a camel in this slide? Some of you might be, especially those who can't filter out irrelevant thoughts, are like, why is there a camel? What? And I'm sure you have incredible stories about why there is a camel. It's very boring, the reason why there is a camel. There's an old joke in psychology. We say a camel is a horse designed by a committee. Okay? And the issue that I want to highlight is that so many people keep reinventing competency frameworks and models, etc., to think of employability. Is actually very, very simple. You know, there are just three major dimensions that distinguish or that predict different levels of employability: ability, likability, and drive. Okay, that's it. Of course, you can double-click on this, and there will be different, sub-facets or sub-levels. I mean, ability, what is it? What do we mean? Is it IQ? Is it curiosity? Is it expertise? Is it knowledge? I mean, it's all of those things. And it's important to remember that it's also very domain-specific, right? Organizational psychologists and consultants sometimes forget this. Like, even if the person flying your plane has a great sense of humor and is a transformational leader, you probably want them to be a pilot, right? And even if the person about to do a root canal in your teeth is, you get the gist, right? So I mean, technical skills and expertise is important, but at the same time, we know that ability is becoming more and more of a soft skill in the way we think, and that it's more not about, it's not just, or nowadays, predominantly not about what you know already or what you can do, but what you could do and what you could learn. And that's why learnability is so important. Okay, you can have people with the same qualifications, same expertise, same experience, but if I can predict what they're supposed to do in 6 weeks or 6 years, I'll be better off betting on someone who can probably learn it, even if I don't know what it is. Okay, and that's going to be more likely if somebody is more curious. And then you have likability, which is basically EQ, and drive, which is basically ability or motivations. I mean, if you think about employability, this is it. It's very, very simple. And even though it's simple, it's not that easy to think of many people, case studies, that have 3 out of 3, right? Think about, of course, you all do. But if you think about the people you work with or who work for you, how many really would you say they're really able, they're really likable, and they're really hardworking? Mostly, if they're doing well, probably 2 out of 3. And there's an interesting interplay here. A lot of the times, people who are very able are obnoxious. People who are not so able work really hard. And then you have, but 3 out of 3 will almost certainly make you successful. Even if your boss hates you and doesn't want to promote you, you're going to get there eventually. 2 out of 3, you probably have a job. 1 out of 3, probably you don't. 0 out of 3, probably unemployable. I was giving a similar presentation a while ago in Germany, and when I said, 1 out of 3 probably unemployed, 0 out of 3, somebody said, you can work for the government. I said, okay. Germans and their sense of humor. So what I'm trying to say here is that if you think about ability, you can think about learnability as a critical component or driver of ability levels, not just what people know today, but what they could know in the future. We also know that learnability boosts employee engagement, and it's so important to understand that engagement affects not just individual, but also team and organizational levels of performance. These are three main drivers of engagement. They all have a relationship to learnability. When you leave people alone and you give them time and you enable them to develop or unleash their curiosity, they will be more engaged. By doing that, you help people develop a sense of mastery. They know that they're working not just because of the salary or benefits or to pay the bills, but actually they're growing and developing. And most importantly, it gives people a sense of purpose, okay, which is very, very important. I know that sometimes it gets kind of overhyped by the positive psychology community, but meaning and purpose is important. You know, it's a sign of progress that 100 years after the invention of scientific management and Fordism and assembly line, we are worrying about, does this job mean something for me and does it have a sense of purpose? It means that we've progressed and evolved, okay? And even so, you can see how rarely these things happen in the world of work today, okay? So we know from employee engagement surveys that only about 30% of people are engaged. If you watch Mad Men, this is a very good slide to illustrate this. Don Draper, clearly the most valuable employee and talent in his advertising agency, and he works about 20 minutes a day, right? And the rest is drinking or smoking or eating lunch or sleeping. This is him in one of his power naps. And I mean, this happens a lot. It's a terrible loss of productivity, especially when your most talented employees are not engaged and they don't care. Okay? It's been calculated that in the US alone, there's a productivity loss of about $450 billion a year caused by disengagement. How many walls could we build? Sorry. Then we also know that there's a lot of people who are passive job seekers. I think it's very interesting. For example, LinkedIn, which has about 450 million members, reckons that about 70% of those members are considered passive job seekers. Somebody at LinkedIn once told me, we have a lot of data to crunch, but what we can tell for sure based on this data is that when somebody updates their profile, they're looking for a job, actively. Otherwise, they're waiting. And so a lot of people are not actively sending resumes or applications, but they're hoping for better job opportunities. I always think we don't understand the severity of it. If you think about the equivalent in the realm of relationships, imagine if 75% of married people were open to a better opportunity, not actively seeking, but I mean, we would surely talk about a crisis of marital satisfaction. Divorce rates are 50%, which is lower than that, right? We also know that self-employment is on the rise, even in places where job opportunities abound and where unemployment rates are fairly low. And so this is one of the symptoms or consequences of disengagement. Most people, of course, work for themselves in order not to have a boss, not to have a manager, or because it's harder to complain about your boss when you are the boss. And at the same time, there's a rise in startup activity. A line that I've stolen from Harvard Business Review. It was an article they wrote a couple of years ago, "The Dangerous Rise of Entrepreneurship Porn." It's a great title. I wish I had come up with it. Silicon Valley, great show, makes fun of these people, right? Everybody. I've been teaching MBA students for about 15 years. And in the beginning, they wanted to work for Deloitte, JP Morgan, then Google, Facebook. Now, they all think they're going to be the next Elon Musk, And the chances of success are 0.00001 of that level of success. Even the chances of launching a business and still being in existence 5 years later or having employees are less than 5%, okay? So it's all good fueling these ambitious, but they're unrealistic expectations, and it's often talented people who would be a great resource for organizations. So the underlying causes of this thing is the same thing. People are disenchanted with their work. If we help people develop and nurture their learnability in organizations, we would have less of this. Okay, so with Mara, we wrote a short article referencing this issue in HBR last year on how and what employers can do to develop and nurture people's learnability. And another reason, we also know that learnability prevents or at least slows down automation or the chances that your job or that you are automated, okay? And I know you heard a lot about automation. Jonas speaks a lot about automation. He's a great expert on the subject. I don't want to talk too much about this. This is a great image, isn't it? Could be your future boss. This is a great book that I want to recommend by Martin Ford, Rise of the Robots. Really, really well written. He's a journalist, but a lot of data. I'm sure some of you might be familiar with Raymond Kurzweil, Google's futurist, the polymath who has 150 patents and who thinks he's going to live forever. He talks, of course, about singularity. I think it's a very interesting, at least conceptually or high level, it's a very interesting idea, the fact that humans have reached the pinnacle or the limits of biological evolution. We can only evolve further if we merge with technology or become as one with technology. And of course, you can see in this simple slide here that humans have used technology for a long, long time. Our ancestors used technology for a long, long time. This is also a funny slide showing how sometimes becoming more comfortable or more dependent with technology can harm or have a negative impact on us physiologically as well. But it's an interesting idea, this idea that, if you think about it already now, and you think about two hypothetical countries or cultures, one that is really, really comfortable and at ease with technology and very high tech, and the other that doesn't have technology, you can think how the techno kind of savvy country or system will outperform the other. Okay? So, it's also interesting that although technology makes us capable of smarter outputs, it also makes us dumber in a way because we become very, very dependent and all of our knowledge and information is outsourced. But I think, from a kind of employability standpoint, the interesting thing here is that you have, on the one hand, machines trying to become more spiritual, to use Ray Kurzweil's line, or more like human. And also humans becoming more like machine-like, okay? Some of you might be quite similar to this character here, not far off, right? If you're connected via 2, 3, 4 devices and maybe have some other at home, etc. So, it's an interesting crossover potentially, right? And I think, we're living in the age of this sort of spiritual workaholic in a way, right? There's something from the beginnings of scientific management theory, this idea that if you measure and quantify everything and divide jobs into molecular components, you can turn people into productivity machines, hasn't fully gone away, right? That's why we have the quantified self and all these wearables, etc., because we want employees to be engaged and find meaning, but we also want to turn them into productive machines. If not, we'll use machines instead, okay? So it makes sense that if you can learn new skills and nurture your curiosity, and if you never stop learning, that you will have an edge, at least over the people who don't do that. Yeah, this old story of two guys who, I think Sternberg used it in the book Successful Intelligence. It opens up with this story of two guys who are in the forest and they see a big bear, and one guy says to the other, let's start running, and the other guy starts putting on his running shoes. And the guy says, what are you doing? The bear will still catch you. Yeah, but I'm going to be faster than you. Okay, so you can think about, at least from a pragmatic or evolutionary survival of the fittest metaphor as learnability as something that might not make you smarter than machines, but it might make you smarter than other people who will be outperformed by machines quicker. And what do we know about how this changes through the lifespan? Okay, and there's a lot of research on this too, and I'm going to really now show you the gloomy part of the presentation. Although it shouldn't surprise you, right? Do people become more or less curious as they grow older? Right? So no surprises, but I'm going to show you some data on this. First, we know that fluid intelligence, which is basically the aspect of ability or intelligence that determines how fast you can think, how fast you can learn new things. And if you think about your brain as a computer, imagine it's the speed of processing, how many memory RAMs it is, how many things you can do at the same time, etc. And that if there's, I think most people here are over 25, if not all, so you're all in decline already. And this is why the best chess players in the world are under 30, the best mathematicians in the world are under 30s, because there's a lot of kind of working memory, fast processing, and as we grow older, that kind of gets slower and slower and slower. The good news is that our crystallized intelligence, so our expertise or what we know, continues to go up. So basically, we become slower but more knowledgeable. However, you need to work to become more knowledgeable. It doesn't come automatically, So it's a compensatory strategy in a way. There's a great definition of expertise by the philosopher Martin Heidegger. He said expertise is the ability to ignore the irrelevant elements of a situation. As you have experience, expertise, compared to a novice, you don't need to work things out. You already know how to do something, so you can rely on that. But if it's about learning new things, we will need to motivate and force ourselves more to make that happen, because we can't rely on our fluid intelligence. If you think about the Raven's matrices test, it's a very good test of fluid intelligence. It's nothing to do with your expertise, with what you learn, but can you really learn or work out logical problems fast? What do we know about openness to experience? So curiosity or inquisitive. And this is the line. You can see here also that after the age of 30, it starts declining. I mean, this is also manifested in voting intentions. People are kind of left-wing and liberal until their 30s, and then they become more right-wing. I mean, this is the reason why the term we use is conservative. It's about conserving what you know, and you don't once you reach a certain age or state, you don't want to change your mind. You've made up your mind, so everybody who disagrees with you is wrong and everything else is fine, so that you economize mental processes and you can work on other things. So our desire to preserve what we already know increases with age, and it makes us more narrow-minded. Yeah, I mean, in general, people become more boring and narrow-minded as they grow older. We become kind of less extroverted, less open to new experiences, more emotionally stable, but also more kind of rigid, conscientious, and a little bit more disagreeable. What can we do? This is the final part, and then I'm going to open up for questions. Hopefully you have a lot of questions or comments, or you tell me what you think. What can we do to boost, really our own learnability? If companies or managers are not going to do it for us, what can people do to do this independently? And here are the 6 points that we illustrated in another article we wrote with Mara. 6 things to do when your job kills your curiosity. 1, know what you don't know. Great quote here by Stephen Hawking. The greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance, it's the illusion of knowledge. Or I think Mark Twain said, it's not what you know, what you don't know that will kill you, is what you know for sure that isn't true. Yeah. So I think this is why it's so important to get feedback and get some awareness as to maybe how knowledgeable you really are. And the problem is, of course, we live in a world where very few people provide this feedback. So surround yourself with people who can be brutally honest and tell you, actually, you don't know what you're talking about. Here's a book, here's a link, find out. So know your limitations. This is a real picture. Second, stop focusing on your strengths. It's a famous kind of arm wrestler who obviously focused too much on one arm and not on the other. But it's a good image to illustrate the ludicrous premise of the strengths-based movement. That you should only realize what you're good at and focus on that, which means you don't develop any other skills, you don't perfect any of your defects, and you take the easy and comfortable route, which is to just play to your strengths of what you already know. How are you going to become better? And even people who are very, very good at certain things have issues that they need to address. Okay. Third, very important, and I can't believe it's the first time I'm mentioning Facebook here, but cut down the distractions. This isn't the real tagline or mantra of Facebook, but it could well be, right? In fact, this is a real quote by Mark Zuckerberg, founder of Facebook. A squirrel dying in front of your house may be more relevant to your interests right now than people dying in Africa. You heard about the filter bubble, yeah? Big concept, the fact that people don't just pick bubbles in the physical world, but they also live in virtual bubbles, where they surround themselves with people who tell them what they want to hear, and that's why we're surprised. What? What happened in these elections? Or how did Brexit happen? Or none of my friends said anything. Well, it's because we are narrow-minded and live in these bubbles. But more importantly, the issue that I have with Facebook and social media and these things is that they kind of satisfied a very short-term and short-sighted, impulsive, craving-like form of curiosity. You know, it's the equivalent of kind of fast food, no nutritional value, but it creates more craving, and then it makes us all ADHD, and it's very difficult to concentrate, read, or think when you're living in this world of distractions, okay? I mean, you can even think that from an evolutionary standpoint, maybe our ancestors, I mean, it was good to be higher on curiosity because you know, they needed to explore different environments and maybe find something to hunt or something to reproduce somewhere else, and it kept them outside their boundaries. Now that information is in an overload stage and it comes to us and we're bombarded, it's probably more adaptive to have the ability to ignore this, right? Because it's like fast food or junk food to our nutritional system. That said, of course, we know that even people who spend a lot of time on Facebook are not equally curious. Some interesting work done by my colleagues at Cambridge. They looked at different activities and different kind of footprints. And by activities, I mean comments, likes, groups that join, of people who are higher and lower on curiosity, and you can see big differences there as well. So what I'm trying to say is that there are a lot of curious people in Facebook as well, but at the same time, in general, Facebook and other forms of social media do tend to kill rather than nurture our curiosity. 4, hang out with people who are different from you. Yeah, and I mean, this is kind of making the point here from an ethnical standpoint, but you can think about it in all sorts of terms. We tend to gravitate towards people who are like you. It's a kind of socially accepted form of narcissism. You know, if you're similar to me and I really like you, it's like an accepted way of liking myself. So the less narcissistic you are, the more likely it is that your friends are different from you. Sometimes you have to force yourself to do this. It doesn't come naturally, especially when other people have the same problem. 5, volunteer and say yes more often. You know, there's a lot of people who even if they just occasionally try to do things they haven't done before and try to proactively say yes to activities that are unusual, that might grow and develop their curiosity further. And finally, embrace psychological diversity. Whether, I mean, this happens, you know, if you're a manager, you tend to get in your team or employ people and reward and get along with people who have your same values. If you're an employee and you work in teams, you will get along better with people who are like you. So, I mean, sometimes the really strongest and most powerful way to understand the concept of diversity is in terms of psychological diversity. You know, accept people even in your Facebook feed that have very, very different attitudes and values than you. And it might be difficult to tolerate, but it will make you more open-minded. It will help you see the world from a different perspective. Okay, so that's all I have for you. The presentation you can download from that website. And if you haven't seen the documentary we did a couple of years ago, The Science of Personality, it's very nice, 35 minutes. If you have nothing better to do this weekend or you don't have a life, nice glass of wine, www.thescienceofpersonality.com. Thank you.